Well, Ed may have escaped last night, me saying some nice words about him, but I just want to reiterate, we all owe a great debt from the Office of Historian on down, the Historical Advisory Committee. Ed has just done a fabulous job, and he has left the office in just absolutely great hands, and I think there's just a great future ahead. And Ed is retiring, for those of you who don't know, at the end of this month, and sorry, but I think we need to start off with a warm round of applause for Ambassador Ed. Thank you very much. Well, this is just the first in a series of absolutely wonderful panels. I'd just like to very briefly introduce our distinguished panelists today. First up will be Bill Burr, who's a senior analyst at the National Security Archive, where he directs its nuclear history documentation project and edits the archive's Nuclear Vault website. He is the author and editor of too many collections and articles to list, and we are delighted to have him here today. Our second panelist will be Sir Lawrence Freedman from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. I have to just say, his bio is too long for me to say, but I have to say the first book that I ever read on nuclear strategy was actually his Evolution of Nuclear Strategy, so this is a big moment for me to actually get to hear him, and we're just delighted that he could come all the way over here to join us today. Our third and fourth panelists, and I grouped them together, is because both of them have been Stanley Kaplan postdocs at Williams College and are definitely two of my favorite political scientists. And going third will be Brendan Green, who's our current Stanley Kaplan visiting postdoc. Brendan wrote his PhD at MIT under the direction of Barry Posen. His research interests include U.S. foreign policy, liberalism in world politics, military doctrine, the role of ideas in international politics, and it's been wonderful getting to know Brendan this year. Our batting cleanup today will be Josh Rovner. One of the good things about having Brendan here is he could tell me that for the 2 years that I employed Josh, I mispronounced his name for 2 years in a row, which Josh, it's a long overdue apology, but it's Josh Rovner. And Josh is just a great guy, also from MIT, now an associate professor of strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College. And with that, I'll turn everything over to Bill. We're going to try and wrap up by about 10:45, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor McAllister, and thank you for the organizers of this conference for setting up such a great event. A few years ago, Henry Kissinger surprised many when he joined 3 former senior officials in signing a Wall Street Journal op-ed calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. This was a worthy goal, but Kissinger probably did not support it because of scruples about nuclear weapons. Instead, perceptions of a greater threat from nuclear proliferation made him conclude the U.S. would be safer in a world where nuclear weapons no longer exist. 40 years ago, in another era, Kissinger was less concerned about proliferation, and abolition was a pipe dream. He wanted to find ways to make nuclear weapons and nuclear threats more usable for deterrence and other purposes, and to shape how weapons would be used if deterrence failed. Today I'll be discussing nuclear war planning during Richard Nixon's first term. First, I'll discuss the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the Nuclear War Plan, the SIOP. Second, I'll talk about White House reactions to the SIOP, which Nixon and Kissinger saw as catastrophic because of its horrific scale and its inflexibility. Third, I'll talk about the mixed successive efforts to change the SIOP during the early 1970s. I'll be drawing on documents in the National Security Volume to a great extent, but it's necessary to use other materials to get a full picture of these developments. As veteran Cold Warriors, both Nixon and Kissinger saw the Soviet Union as an adversary whose influence had to be contained, although their version of containment came to include measures connected with détente, from arms control to export credits. For Nixon and Kissinger, alliances with nations in Western Europe and Northeast Asia were basic elements of the containment system and the U.S. power position generally. But Nixon worried, as documents in these volumes suggest, that changes in the strategic posture of the Soviet Union could weaken alliance relations by raising questions about the credibility of U.S. commitments. For example, after hearing about new Soviet ICBMs at an NSC meeting, Nixon concluded very pessimistically that the U.S. was the second most powerful nation and cautioned that we can't give the impression we are number two. That, he warned, could raise questions among allies about the credibility of U.S. security guarantees and the credibility of nuclear deterrence. Moreover, Nixon would argue, also pessimistically, that with U.S.-Soviet strategic parity, the nuclear umbrella that was a basic element of security guarantees to key allies was no longer credible. These were controversial positions in Washington, but the credibility of deterrence was a matter of supreme importance to Nixon and Kissinger because they believed it provided the underpinnings of U.S. global influence. A problem that Nixon and Kissinger found especially troubling was that the war plan that would come into play if deterrence failed were altogether incredible and also undercut the credibility of deterrence. Soon after he was inaugurated, Nixon went to the Pentagon for a briefing on the SIOP. The possibility, however remote, that Cold War could lead to hot war with Moscow made it customary for presidents to learn something about the SIOP and actions to implement it. The briefing was on the most recent iteration of the SIOP, SIOP 64, fiscal year 64, which provided the template for nuclear war planning until the mid-1970s. What Nixon heard remains partly classified, but enough has been released about the SIOP to fill in some of the blanks. The briefing was largely technical about options and mechanisms for launching nuclear war. Nixon learned that in a crisis with the Soviet Union that was leading to war, the president had 5 attack options. 3 of the 5 attack options were premised on strategic warning. That is, if somehow U.S. intelligence determined that Moscow was gearing up for war, the president had a preemptive option, virtually a first strike. And there were 3 different preemptive options. I'll just describe one now. One of them was an attack against Soviet missile bases, bomber bases, submarine pens, a sort of a counterforce strike. This attack could also include attacks on military and political control centers, including Moscow, but urban areas would be spared from this attack. So this is a classic counterforce strike designed to limit damage to the U.S. and to minimize civilian casualties on both sides. Alternatively, if the Soviets struck first, there were 2 retaliatory options. One was another counterforce strike against the empty silos, I guess, and the other was a combined strike against nuclear targets, conventional military targets, and urban industrial targets of the Soviet Union, a massive all-out strike in retaliation. Now, all 5 options included several hundred weapons targeting air defense sites, radars, and so forth, so bombers could reach their targets, get rid of the air defense, and the bombers could go in. The scale of the attack was massive. For example, the smallest option included over 1,700 weapons, which would certainly have caused millions and millions of casualties, ultimately on both sides. 3 years later, in 1972, the smallest option was 2,500 nuclear weapons, another calamitous attack. One wit in the Pentagon mordantly characterized the situation as 5 options for massive retaliation. Now, it's surprising that the National Security Volume does not include any descriptive information on the SIOP because users would have benefited from some documentation. Now, the SIOP poses a tough declassification target. There's no question about that, a real challenge, but information on its basic structure to the 1960s has been available for several years. Now, it's clear from reading this volume that the SIOP had few partisans in the White House. Kissinger criticized it often. But the criticisms are to be understood in context. It's necessary to provide some information on the SIOP for a baseline. Now, documents in this volume and other sources make it evident that Kissinger and Nixon did not see the SIOP as a credible or useful design for warfighting or for deterrence. Kissinger told the Defense Policy Review Committee that he would hate to have the president in a position where his only option was to kill 25% of the Russian population when he knew that they would then kill 50% of the American population. This helped make Kissinger call the SIOP a horror strategy. Nixon did not object to first strikes or counterforce as such. At an NSC meeting, he suggested that such threats would be a diplomatic asset. But like Kissinger, he objected to the lack of real options and was disquieted by the massive casualties. In his first foreign policy report, Nixon asked this question: should a president, in the event of a nuclear attack, be left with a single option of ordering the mass destruction of enemy civilians in the face of certainty that would be followed by the mass slaughter of Americans. And Nixon and Kissinger worried that lack of real options could reduce U.S. freedom of action in regional crises, such as in the Middle East or Europe. They wanted to make nuclear weapons, or at least nuclear threats, more usable in those circumstances. In language that evoked his book on nuclear weapons and foreign policy, Kissinger said that there was a risk of our being paralyzed in a crisis because of the lack of plans short of an all-out SIOP response. Kissinger also observed that the SIOP had functions that were not the same as when we had superiority, by which he meant that the preemptive options were designed when the U.S. had a clear advantage over the Russians, and damage limitation, might have worked a little bit. These criticisms of the SIOP were significant. Kissinger would acknowledge that there was no rational reason to be found for going to general nuclear war. But he wanted the war plans rethought so they provided more options, were more credible for crisis management and for deterrence, and were more reasonable, or at least as reasonable as any plans to use nuclear weapons could be. Once he was at the White House, Kissinger made small attempts to get the Joint Chiefs of Staff to consider the feasibility of smaller, scaled-down counterforce options. But JCS Chairman Wheeler dragged his feet and argued that smaller options could weaken deterrence and trigger massive escalation by the Russians. Not one to take no for an answer, in June of that year, June 69, Kissinger asked Nixon to sign National Security Study Memorandum 64, which would look at U.S. and Soviet capabilities to carry out and deter less than all-out attacks. Ultimately, the purpose was to determine the feasibility of more discriminating options than the present SIOP. Some months later, the JCS prepared a response to NISM 64 on the concept of limited strategic nuclear war. This study, important parts of which are in the Fruce volume, as document 129, provided a lot of information and reviewed pros and cons, but made no recommendations. It suggested a capability to wage limited strategic nuclear war, short of full SIOP execution, could strengthen deterrence by reinforcing perceptions of the risk of conflict. Yet if deterrence failed, limited options might make it possible to end a conflict short of general war. But control was a key problem. If nuclear war was to be kept limited, command and control over military forces had to be as tight and as comprehensive as possible. But command and control vulnerabilities were a key problem. Command centers could be destroyed and might not be reliable during a multi-exchange limited nuclear war. In the president's position, the president's vulnerability was a key problem that was very difficult to solve. The conclusions were equivocal. On the one hand, rejecting a limited options approach could be risky. The Soviets might develop a capability on their own. But accepting it could also be risky. For example, limited strikes could make escalation to general war more likely, as Wheeler had suggested. So this is a continuing theme, the danger of escalation. The study went to Kissinger with recommendations for more thinking about alternative force requirements and the costs, but nothing further happened. Another major study on strategic objectives from January 72, summarized in document 204, reviewed the potential of strategic flexible response, although more fully in the longer version, not included. Like the NISM 64 study, it made the argument that a flexible response strategic capability could make deterrence more credible by reinforcing Soviet perceptions of the risks. But the study raised concerns. One was that a capability for flexible response could weaken deterrence, or maybe make it more tempting to use nuclear weapons when it shouldn't be tempting to use them, and also raise the risk of escalation. Whether the Soviets would even accept the limited use of nuclear weapons, of strategic weapons, had to be considered. Now, the DPR study raised some interesting questions, but made no recommendations on revising the SIOP. Around the same time, at the end of 1971, Kissinger and his advisors at the NSC were getting restive and were thinking about ordering a new SIOP study. But Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird took the next step by assigning John Foster, Director of Defense Research and Engineering, to assemble a panel for a study of nuclear weapons employment policy, an unaccepted term that came to be used during the 1970s. As Terrence Tariff argued in his book on the Foster panel, by taking this initiative, Laird could steal a march and affirm the Pentagon's autonomy in the face of Kissinger's efforts to impose his will on the military bureaucracy. Now, the National Nuclear Targeting and Attack Panel involved senior officials from the Air Force, the Joint Staff, and the Defense Department. It operated in complete secrecy, and Kissinger did not learn about it until it was nearly finished in the summer of 1972. This panel was a significant exercise that was followed up by a major NSC study in 1973, which Foster also directed. The next step was the important National Security Decision Memorandum, NSDM number 242, which Nixon signed in January 74, which directed the bureaucracy to put the Foster panel concepts into effect. Now, it's surprising that the National Security volume did not include the Foster panel's report. Now, basic information about the report itself, has already been declassified. It's possible the classification issues could have held up some details, but including this formative report would have made a good volume even stronger. In any event, Kissinger found out about the panel and got a briefing in July 1972. One of his advisors explained that the panel's report was a radical departure from current guidance in substance and in format. The difference is that the current policy is to win the war through the destruction of the enemy's forces and military capability, while the new proposed policy aims at trying to stop the war quickly and at a low level of destruction, exactly what Kissinger had in mind. The defense proposal recommended controlling escalation by providing limited options which would make it possible to demonstrate our resolve, this is a quote, to demonstrate our resolve in a crisis and punish the enemy, but to refrain from striking cities so as to provide an incentive for terminating the conflict. Moreover, unlike the SIOP, which is predicated on the least likely scenarios of a massive Soviet attack or U.S. preemptive strike, the new policy proposal recognized the great uncertainty that exists as to how a war might begin. So the policymakers had a broad choice of plans. The Foster panel proposed 4 types of attack options: major attack options, selected, regional, and limited attacks. Now, the details of limited attacks were left up in the air, with the panel recommending a JCS planning staff to develop pre-planned options. What limited options would mean in practice was inherently controversial. For example, some argued that it could involve strikes by accurate warheads against Soviet missile silos, but that raised debate over whether hard target kill capability would weaken or strengthen deterrence. The Foster panel also had ideas for revamping the SIOP, for revamping SIOP targeting, so if smaller strikes failed, then you'd have to go to a major war. Under the major attack options, nuclear forces would be used to destroy those military, political, and economic assets that were essential to the enemy's post-war recovery. So the new goal was getting recovery targets. To the extent the recovery targets were destroyed, the U.S.'s post-war power and influence would be enhanced relative to the adversary. Now, destroying population as such was not and could not be an important objective, because that would violate international law. But political control centers, army bases, and industrial facilities would be treated as recovery targets. But however the targets were categorized, striking such installations would mean mass killings, even if the targeting was carefully tailored to minimize fatalities. Now, as it turned out, it was easier for target planners to develop major attack plans than to create limited options. Standard operating procedures that gave priority to large-scale attacks and targeting strategic forces were hard to change. Thus, massive options remained the template into the 1980s. And questions about the plausibility of limited options would continue to be raised. For example, despite his sponsorship of the Foster panel, Laird was not enthusiastic. Years later, in an interview, he said that the notion of improving the credibility of war plans through limited options sounds great, but the idea of dropping a few nuclear weapons somewhere is not practical. What concerned Laird was whether escalation could actually be controlled. And the problem of escalation control, of course, was really impossible to solve. In any event, the Nixon White House helped set in motion a significant policy development that succeeding presidents and their advisors would continue to try to create more military options for the president and to try somehow to make nuclear deterrence more credible. But more needs to be learned about developments under Nixon and Kissinger. It would be interesting to know more about Kissinger's thinking on limited options. For example, whether he saw them as potentially useful for coercive diplomacy, as exemplified by Nixon's madman theory. Just as important, we need to learn whether Nixon and Kissinger privately discussed if and how nuclear weapons could be used, just as Kennedy and McNamara had when the latter gave his famous advice about not going first, about not using the weapons first. Besides trying to avoid massive use, what kind of constraints did Nixon and Kissinger see on the use of nuclear weapons? So some top officials, as we see in this volume, some top officials like David Packard saw tactical nuclear weapons as unusable. And Nixon said during NSC meeting that we will never use the tactical nuclears. But Nixon said a variety of things about using nuclear weapons. Yet if that statement represented a settled view, more needs to be learned about how he got there. Now, Nina Tannenwald makes a good case that nuclear taboo thinking influenced Nixon and Kissinger. It would be worth knowing how important they saw it was to avoid crossing the bright line and using nuclear weapons first. With that, I'll stop and thank you for your attention.
So first, thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to be here and to see a lot of old friends. These volumes are really very important to me because it's sort of where I came in as a research student in Oxford in from 1972 to 1975. This is the stuff I worked on. This is the basis for my PhD on US intelligence and the Soviet strategic threat. So my first comment is to thank the State Department for all the effort that you've put into confirming my PhD. It's obviously, if I'd had the documents, I would have told the story with a bit less speculation and a bit more granularity and probably more colour. But if anything, these documents would have sharpened rather than significantly changed the analysis that I came to then. Now, the sources I used in the 1970s were essentially whatever I could lay my hands on. And this included newspaper articles, because so much of this story was leaked to the New York Times and the Washington Post, the specialist journals, the Air Force Journal, the wonderful treasure trove of leaks, the Aviation Week and Space Technology, Scientific American, with these elaborate articles by all those nuclear scientists who had built the bomb and were desperately struggling to control it, and a lot of books by participants. I mean, the point I'm making is a lot of this story was out there at the time in some detail. One of the best sources was congressional hearings, of which there's not a lot of reference here. But the congressional hearings were incredibly important, particularly those run Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And one of the great funs of a research student was to take all these different hearings and see what was redacted in one hearing and discover that it wasn't redacted at all in another. And so you did what I suppose a decent Soviet intelligence officer would have been doing, is try to work out what was going on from actually the considerable material that was released at the time. You know, part of the fun of doing research. There's a methodological point here. Obviously, having all these documents would have saved me a hell of a lot of time. But I don't think in principle I could have ignored the other stuff. The off-the-record comments, the stuff that's leaked, the odd bits of specialist detail, provides the sort of insights into motives and preoccupations that even these documents, which I must say do benefit enormously from the transcripts, which do give you something which you, in earlier Frus documents, you don't get quite so much of. I think the transcripts do add an awful lot. But even so, I think you'd still need to go back and look at what else was being said at the time. There's plenty of allusions in these documents to the wider policy debates, but I still think you need to actually read the debates. And I say this because I've always been a bit of a scavenger when it comes to sources, and I worry that contemporary historians who have an expectation of so much documentation also disregard too much that they dismiss as secondary and become archival fetishists. I'm a great believer in secondary sources. Because often what was written at the time tells you what was understood at the time, and an interpretive framework that's often hard to reproduce from the documents themselves. Now, background. The body politic in the time, with Vietnam still a toxin in the system, was anti-military. And the Safeguard ABM program was Nixon's first big ask of a skeptical Congress, as Paul Wolfowitz reminded us last night, it only just scraped through. He also reminded us of Albert Wohlstetter, a key figure in these debates, who I suspect would be really disappointed not to find his name in the index. Those of you who knew Albert would realise this was an ego that was hard to accommodate. He was the administration's key expert witness for Safeguard, and one of the reasons why the fight got both nasty and technical at the same time. It's worth recalling that Wohlstetter eventually reported some of his opponents, George Rathsons, Jerry Wiesner, and some others, to the Operational Research Society of America for what he considered to be misleading claims and misuse of the evidence during this very intense debate. And it's just worth keeping in mind just how vitriolic this debate got. I mean, I remember being staggered as doing my research in Washington in the summer of '73, which I have to say was an incredibly distracting time to be doing research as the US government fell apart around me. That Wohlstetter and Pete Scoville, who some of you may recall, were both incredibly kind to me and very helpful, but spent a lot of their time slagging off each other. And I think that was one of my abiding memories of the time, was just how worked up people were getting about the issue. Now, the ABM itself was famously described by Al Gore Sr. As a missile in search of a mission. There's perhaps no more eloquent testimony to that description than Kissinger's comment to the verification panel in January 1971, and I quote, "We're building an area defence which we can't have, justifying a missile defence which won't work, and negotiating an NCA defence we don't want." Made Gore's point for him. It's just worth saying a word about Kissinger as a nuclear strategist. He was one of the original nuclear strategists. And the interesting thing about Kissinger as a nuclear strategist is he had an extraordinary knack of being both derivative and ahead of the game. He was a weather vane. You could tell where the policy was moving because he'd bring out a book which captured exactly just about where the policy was going to go to. He did that in the mid-50s, he did it at the start of the 60s, in the mid-50s with limited nuclear war based on a Council of Foreign Relations study group, and then the Troubled Alliance at the start of the 60s, which saw flexible response. But the point about him was that actually he was old school. He came out of the tradition, the first sort of wave of nuclear strategists whose background was in history and politics. Bernard Brodie was the greatest, I think. But he was of that school. He wasn't a Rand type. He knew what they were doing, but technically you could find all sorts of flaws in the sort of stuff he was doing. He was always about the relationship between weaponry and politics. That's what interested him. And therefore, I don't think we should be surprised to find that's the way he's looking at it in these documents. He's sort of aware of the technical stuff. I don't think he's ever completely on top of it, but he does have a view about the relationship between weaponry and foreign policy. And that's even more true, of course, with Nixon himself. And I think some of the Nixonian sort of quotes that come out of this are quite fascinating. Now, Nixon wanted an ABM because he wanted to show that the United States was still in the race and was not going to concede the position to the Soviet Union. And the volume quotes Nixon's memoirs, where he said, "The minute the Europeans or the Japanese decided that we could not be depended upon to keep our commitments and stand up to the Soviets, the American position in Europe and the Far East would be severely damaged." There's a wonderful place in the document of August 71 where he puts it much more pithily, quotes, "The main purpose of our forces is diplomatic wallop." And the early exchanges show him sort of fretting about the loss of comforting superiority, which he keeps on going on about it was 5-1, Ram says 4-1 at the time of Cuba. And he clearly is bothered by the perception that the Americans could be seen as falling behind the Soviet Union. I say for a European, one of the more fascinating comments here comes during the course of one of the first of many discussions that the NSC had, or the principals had, about what mission to give to what had been Sentinel under the Johnson administration was soon to become safeguard. David Packard explains to Nixon that the Soviets would see area defense as a prelude to an offensive build-up. But the president says, well, suppose you could defend cities, really means credible threat of first strike would be much greater if they're screwing with allies. And Packard explains that even with ABM, you're not going to get a first strike capability. Melvin Led comes and says you just simply can't do it. Then later on, Wheeler, who doesn't impress in these documents, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, says, if I thought technically, fiscally feasible to develop ABM defences which gave first strike capability, I would advocate it, destabilising or not. Wouldn't bother me. And Nixon comes in, wouldn't bother me either. Nuclear umbrella in NATO is a lot of crap. Don't have it. Well, thanks, Dick. And there's quite a lot of discussion of European reactions to the perceptions of the Americans falling behind. Gerard Smith, who was sort of a hero figure, I suppose, in these documents, as rather bravely holding his line, well, against considerable odds. But he argued that the Europeans still reassured and the Soviets still deterred, not that different from 10 years ago, and quotes, disturbed to hear the implication that Europe in greater danger today with regard to US nuclear umbrella. And a number of people make the point that actually the Europeans get terribly panicky if it looks like the Americans are going to have a surge in building new nuclear weapons. And I think probably Hal Sonnenfeld, who could have a good feel for Europe, got it basically right. So Europeans would be alarmed by either accepting inferiority or by a drive for superiority. They're sort of basically happy where it was. And it's an issue that was raised in a study of June 69, an NSC study of June 69, under what circumstances would the United States use strategic nuclear weapons to respond to either a conventional or a nuclear attack on our allies? Big question. And the conclusion, primary role of our nuclear forces in the defence of Europe is to raise the Soviet estimate of the expected costs of aggression and to add great uncertainty to their calculations, without necessarily having a decisive influence on the likelihood or form of aggression by Warsaw Pact general purpose forces, i.e. we've got no idea. But it makes their calculations complicated. So if area defence can't allow you first strike, all it can give you is damage limitation. And there are sort of weird conversations about how much it's worth spending to halve numbers killed down from 80 to 90 million people to maybe 60 million people. Great achievement. And it's worth reading, again, just give yourself context, a very influential that was written by McGeorge Bundy at about this time in the I think it was October 69 edition of Foreign Affairs, called To Cap the Volcano, basically support for arms control. And he wrote, quotes, the enormous gulf between what political leaders really think about nuclear weapons and what is assumed in complex calculations of relative advantage in simulated nuclear warfare. In the think tanks, levels of acceptable damage could involve the loss of tens of millions of lives, so that the loss of dozens of great cities is somehow a real choice for sane men. For Bundy, in the real world of real political leaders, a decision that would bring even one hydrogen bomb on one city of one's own country would be recognised in advance as a catastrophic blunder. 10 bombs on 10 cities would be a disaster beyond history, and 100 bombs in 100 cities are unthinkable. Now, I don't think there's any suggestion in these documents that that didn't impress itself on those involved, however much they talked about creating options for them. What was striking, I think, reading this, is how much they're using the concepts inherited from the Johnson administration, from the hated McNamara, of basically the same assured destruction framework. They did come up with their own term, sufficiency, a term neither able to inspire or inform. David Packard was once asked in public what it meant, and he replied, it means that it's a good word to use in a speech. Beyond that, it doesn't mean a goddamn thing. And this created a real problem for the safeguard system, and explains why it got into so much trouble. The problem with discussing why you needed an ABM as a defensive system was you had to get the threat right. If you had too little threat, you didn't need it. And if you had too much threat, it would be overwhelmed. And they never quite made up their minds. The too little threat was China. The too much threat was the Soviet Union. Now, I think Kissinger basically did see the ABM as a bargaining chip and a possible defense against China. But of course, if it was needed as a defense against China, how could it be a bargaining chip? If you need it, it shouldn't be a bargaining chip. You should hold with it. And that was, I think, was always part of the problem Kissinger had in explaining what he was doing. Either this thing had a rationale, in which case was it sensible to give it away or not. In the end, although I think these documents make it clearer than I certainly had appreciated at the time, though I was aware of the ambivalence in what was being said, was that minimum vulnerability was picked on as the case that will make it all work. Now, there was a time when people spoke of little else, and it's hard really to imagine how people got away with it for so long. But essentially, the idea of minimum vulnerability was that one leg of the triad, the ICBMs, Minutemen, could become vulnerable to a first strike. Not the submarine launch missiles, not the bombers, just Minutemen. And the problem was that if that happened, the United States could not launch an equivalent strike back. Partly because a lot of the Soviet ICBMs would have just have come over. Bill made would have just have come over, and so there'd only be holes left to attack on the other side. But also because submarine Poseidon bombers were not considered accurate enough, particularly the Poseidon. So you didn't have an option, and somehow this was going to give the Soviets an advantage. And people got incredibly worked up about this. Now, the reason this became a difficult issue for the administration was that it depended, to make it work for safeguard, you had to show that actually that was the trajectory upon which the Soviet Union had put itself. And the big focus of this was the SS-9 missile, which makes a number of guest appearances in these volumes. This was with a single warhead, 25 megaton, a great big thing. And it required it to develop a MIRV capability. Now, one of the difficulties with MIRV, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, was that this was an American technology. America had two technologies, the MRVs, which was just multiple reentry vehicles, and multiply independently targeted reentry vehicles. And it was a critical decision. Now, Polaris had been tested with MRV, and there is a view that that's where Soviets got the ideas from, and that what they were doing was somewhere in between. If it was a full MIRV capability with a certain degree of accuracy and certain numbers, then hypothetically it was possible, if they only targeted one warhead against one silo, and the silos hadn't been hardened very much, that it could knock out the ICBMs. It was a little far-fetched, but you could just about argue it. And then you see in these documents the debates going on about the SS-9, which is all the stuff that leaked to the press, which I used for my thesis. And there's a document by Lawrence Lynn which he talks about this as being the most badly split estimate of all time, with the CIA sticking to its view that this was not an MIRV and everybody else questioning it. Lynn said in his sort of analysis of this, which is pretty hostile to the CIA, we can say virtually nothing about the purposes and objectives of the SS-9 program. The evidence does not justify our making any presumptions or any projections. Kissinger in his memoir, which is quoted, agrees that Helms was right, but says at the time he took the more ominous view of the capabilities. And there's also in there Nixon going to some senators and saying, and now we come to a really secret moment, I'm going to tell you they're developing an MIRV. which they weren't. But that was part of the case that's being made. Now, the problem that the administration created for itself by all of this is it created a threat it couldn't actually deal with. As Kissinger bargained away the ABM, one of the methods that people were coming up with to deal with the problem was whisked away. There's a sort of a rather poignant memo by Melvin Laird where he starts to talk about mobile ICBMs as one of the things you're going to be able to do in the future as a possible response. So here you see Welcome MX and the racetrack system and all that extraordinary nonsense that dominated the Paul Carter administration until Scowcroft killed it off in 1983. Remember fratricide, the fratricide effect? There was some, they were all, anyway, too much damn memory lane. So there's quite late on in the documents there's a discussion of this where it poses the alternative views. There's one view that says, well, it says that nobody thinks that each individual bit of the triad should have a capability against an independent survivability, an independent capability to have to sort of handle the whole deterrent. You have to recognise that they support each other. But there's a sort of convoluted discussion about why it might be a problem in crisis stability that if the Soviets did have an ability to take out all of the Minutemen. But also it gives the arguments as to why it wouldn't make a lot of difference, because the overall retaliatory capability would preclude any significant gain by the Soviets if they could actually do such an attack. And of course, now there were some studies that were done later on that demonstrated that this attack, sort of surgical strike against Minuteman ICBMs, would kill about 8 million or so Americans and wipe out a number of states. And so the idea that a president would say, gosh, they haven't really hurt us by this, we will only retaliate, we will have to find a retaliation in kind. It's just nonsense. It would have been perceived as a counter-city attack or counter-population attack, because a lot of people would have been killed. So the problem for the administration is that they created this monster, the Minuteman vulnerability. You see it coming out here. I don't think you get in the documents what you got in the public debate, which is the intensity with which this argument was pushed, particularly by people like Wohlstetter, Richard Pearl, and so on. Kissinger, in the next, is eventually talking about a window of vulnerability before all this can be solved. And then I say, eventually, Scowcroft comes along, the Scowcroft Commission in '83, and says, actually, it's not a problem. That's all right then. And somebody said at the time that it was sort of a bit like the last act of Hamlet, where as everybody's lying on the floor dying, the king comes back from a business trip and wonders what all the fuss has been about. This was an extraordinarily mischievous and unhelpful insert into the debate. And I think what does come out from the documents is the sense that the people who were discussing the policy didn't really believe it. Yet they allowed it to get a life of its own outside. Just to conclude, I think, to be fair, or to keep in mind, especially in the light of what Paul Foots was saying last night, I think it's important that this was seen in '72. I haven't talked much about the arms control volume. It contains a lot of really fascinating stuff. But it was seen as a very important and hopeful moment. It now seems as if, we know what happened afterwards in the Second Cold War. But at the time, this was seen as the end of the Cold War. And I do remember, as I was sort of working my way into this field, wondering whether I'd chosen the wrong field, whether this was something that had now come to its natural conclusion. Maybe I should go into something like urban planning or something like that. And I made this point about 6 or 7 years later, at the start of the 80s, when everything had gone to pot again, and we were into what was called the Second Cold War. And then this guy came up to me after and said, actually, I'm in urban planning and I want to go into arms control. Thank you.
Wow, Brent Scowcroft as Fortinbras. That's a real metaphor right there. I don't think I can match it. This being Lent, I feel I should start by confessing my sins. First of all, I'm not actually a Nixon scholar, and even worse, I'm a political scientist. So my comments are going to bounce between the banal and, shall we say, perhaps the idiosyncratic. But I'm actually very interested in the Nixon period, which lies between sort of the Eisenhower administration, which is an object of my dissertation, and the post-Cold War era. And so if we look at sort of the transition from these two periods, you see at the beginning a period in the 1950s, late 1950s, where basically the conventional balance in Europe is assumed to be lopsidedly against the Americans, while the Americans basically have strategic superiority and a real first strike capability against the Soviets. And by the end of the 1980s, into the Cold War, I think we've got a situation where basically the NATO has a world-beating conventional force that they've built up with real conventional capability, and the strategic situation is completely stalemated, as we often hear. And so I think looking at the Nixon administration, what's interesting about it to me is that maybe we can see a little bit about how this transition happened. And very broadly, maybe that can tell us some interesting things from a theoretical perspective about the basic sources of American posture abroad. And so I hope that I'm going to go over sort of what I think the options were and how Nixon and Kissinger thought about these matters, and hopefully just say a little about the domestic sources of American strategic posture and the international sources. And I guess I would frame it by saying that Nixon is often portrayed, and sort of the Republican Party in general, is portrayed as sort of being liberal internationalism light. So Nixon very much in the mode of Eisenhower, very much into conserving costs, the Nixon doctrine, a kind of restraint to America's foreign position, despite its commitment abroad. And I would say that internationally, I think in this period, the whole idea of sort of bipolar stability has been a big part of the literature. We finally reached a situation where there are just two great powers. That means external balancing concerns are no longer a real problem. All you have is internal balancing. You have a much more sort of stable structure of power. And so examining sort of these documents leads me to believe that we should sort of tweak both of those conclusions a little bit, or at least that there's room for sort of more research in these areas. So my notes naively tell me that at this point I should review extended deterrence. Given the audience, maybe I'll skip that part. But I think that to simplify greatly, once you see parity approaching, there are basically three broad approaches that you can take to the problem of defending Europe. One is deterrence is all we've got, and it's basically all we need. This is going to have nuclear weapons are going to basically stabilize things all the way down. It's probably not really a problem, but if we're going to have a nuclear war, we're really going to have a nuclear war. This was Eisenhower's position. He summed it up by saying, when wrestling with the coming of parity, what could our objectives be in a general war beyond the objective of hitting the Russians as hard as we could? We could not do anything else. They will have started a war. We will finish it. That is all the policy I have. Then there's the sort of flexible response option, which is that we can't defend in Europe for very long, but we can defend for a short period of time, and we can use nuclear weapons, especially tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, as a way to threaten escalation and hopefully cut the war short via bargaining. I think this comes out in the documents strongly, as Sir Lawrence said, as the view of Gerard Smith, who was, as he said, quote, disturbed to hear the implication that Europe is in any greater danger today with regard to the nuclear umbrella. It has always been the case that direct escalation would be hard, but that the current strategy was acceptable. Similarly, Melvin Laird, in some of the documents, basically recommends a strategy of drawing down American forces and relying on escalation through tactical nuclear weapons, that we should, quote, rely on these weapons to deter large-scale conventional threats such as those posed by the Warsaw Pact forces. And the third view is that it's the McNamara view, which is that we live in a mad world. These things basically don't matter except to deter each other, and that means that we need a really robust conventional defense of Europe. And so I think these are basically the three views that you could take of the balance in Europe, and how you viewed sort of the nuclear balance mattered for what you would think about these things. So how did Nixon and Kissinger view the balance, and how did this affect their sort of part of their conventional posture in Europe and this transition to where we get at the end of the Cold War? Well, as has been pointed out, Nixon and Kissinger were obsessed with the Cuban Missile Crisis. They loved the idea of nuclear superiority. They thought we had close to a first strike capability, if not a first strike capability during that time, and they thought it had a major impact on American diplomacy. In short, they would have been happy to get superiority if they could have, but they acknowledged those days were probably not coming back. Again, as Sir Lawrence quoted, it wouldn't bother Nixon if an ABM was destabilizing, if it could really protect American people. It would give a great deal of diplomatic flexibility abroad. And indeed, the Nixon and Kissinger people basically recognized that parity was a big problem for extended deterrence. Nixon said flexible response is baloney. They have the possibility of a conventional option with their greater numbers. We remember our massive retaliation gave us freedom to act. In Europe, we may have to face up to a drastic increase in our conventional capability. Later, he would say the nuclear umbrella is simply no longer there. Our bargaining position has shifted. We must face facts. In general, it was expected that parity would make the Soviets more aggressive. Kissinger would say things like, the war might not start with a strike on the U.S. The Soviets' assured destruction edge would affect their willingness to be more aggressive. The relationship of this new situation to local aggression, specifically in Europe, is the important point. So the Nixon and Kissinger people, I think, are going through this thought process, and they're coming up with, like most Americans, sort of not liking the flexible response option. But the nuclear balance to Nixon and Kissinger was still very important. They thought that even in a situation of parity, the balance mattered in some way. As Kissinger put it, for deterrence, what the other side thinks is as important as what we think. So as we've talked a little bit about the madman theory, if you could convince the other side that you were willing to escalate, that was important, and part of that would have to do with the posture of your force. Kissinger explicitly said, and Nixon agreed and underlined it in the document rejecting the Laird plan, that the deterrent value of any force, nuclear or non-nuclear, cannot be substantially greater than its war-fighting capability. So despite the fact that we were at parity, it was important to try to structure the force in some way, in some of the ways that Mr. Burr has talked about, to make it more credible and use it as a diplomatic weapon. So all of this, you would think, would lead to sort of a major reassessment of America's conventional posture in Europe. And indeed, I think as you go through the documents, you do see that the Nixon and Kissinger administration, basically, the Nixon administration, it just slips out so naturally, right? The Nixon administration, they begin to understand that they've got a really big problem with the American army. Drawing down from Vietnam, the Army is basically totally screwed up. They're switching to an AVF. This is going to have major problems with readiness and the quality of the force in Europe. So it does look like there are some real short-term problems. But what's interesting is just sort of how satisfied they appear to be in the long term, once over the horizon, when they're doing long-term plannings about the American conventional posture in Europe. As a couple people have pointed out, they seem to be pretty sincere in their rejection of using tactical nuclear weapons at all. The value of our theater nuclear weapons is limited to deterring Soviet responses in kind. One of the documents notes, Kissinger is constantly asking questions like, what are we trying to accomplish with our tactical nuclear weapons in Europe? How do we intend to use these forces, if ever? Nixon says, we're never going to use these. It's a big joke. We need a theory of how to use nuclear weapons in Europe. Packard responds at one point, the truth is that there is no way to use them and no way to get rid of them. So this all lends itself to basically option 3. We need to have a robust conventional defense in Europe. And yet, the Nixon people are really, I think, satisfied in the long run with what the European situation looks like. Many of the documents note that strategies that would prepare for a sustained non-nuclear war in Europe, that is something beyond the 90-day criteria from flexible response, would not require additional overseas deployment. It was basically about fixing the forces in CONUS. And that during the whole budget crisis of what should we cut, where should the money come out with, Nixon says, I feel very strongly we ought to be putting more into strategic forces and less into conventional forces. In another split, he says, in this case, I was against budget cuts, but in this case, if we cut it from these parts of general purpose forces, it doesn't cut our real strength. Kissinger notes that forward deployed forces are much more important than long-term reinforcement capability. We really just have to get these forces that we have in Europe set up right. And at the end, they come out sounding a lot like the Kennedy and Johnson people, which is that once we really start thinking about this problem, what you run into are a series of small bore issues. Can we reinforce through France, especially after they've withdrawn from the integrated structure of NATO? Will our allies have enough ammunition? Kissinger at one point is confronted with this as an objection to a robust conventional defense, and he says there's only a 37-day supply of ammunition in Europe, and one of the admirals in the room says, well, the reason for that is you can always get more ammunition. I think that the basic point being here is that the Nixon people sort of understood that in the long term, this was a solvable problem from the American point of view. A robust conventional defense was not as difficult as it's often been made to believe. We've been led to believe. And I think that that's basically what we see with the development of NATO in the 1980s, which is that I think by the end of that time, the NATO forces in Europe would have been eminently capable of pushing back a Soviet attack without a resort to nuclear weapons. And I think that the series of changes that were made to the Army during the end of the Nixon years and through the rest of that period helped lead to that situation. It was a problem that basically got solved. And so what does that tell us? Well, I think it tells us something about the major divisions in domestic politics that can affect strategic posture. Which is that Nixon really isn't much like Eisenhower at all. He doesn't sort of come out of this tradition, I think, of limited restraint and doing, he likes to flirt with the idea of getting allies to do more. He often tells de Gaulle that he'd like France to be a real power again, but he very self-evidently doesn't mean it, judging from his policies. And in fact, he was quite happy with the American posture, I think because basically it was a workable posture for the Americans. And I think that shows us that the domestic changes that were going on in American society between real strategic alternatives, real differences in American grand strategy that were evident in some of the quotes in the administration, I think had basically already changed. The major shift had occurred. In this respect, I think Nixon was much more like his Democratic predecessors than he was like Eisenhower and others before him. Strategically, I would say that the interesting thing to come out of this debate is that, of course, no one is happy with parity. Right? And despite the fact that we have a bipolar balance and something that technologically looks like it should be very stable, there's an intense competition over this issue, an intense competition over strategic technology that drives, what would be a completely unexpected, from sort of just a theoretical point of view, military posture in the strategic realm. I think what's shown out to me in a lot of the documents about the ABM stuff was how much Nixon stressed the importance of technological innovation, which is that was actually a lot of his key argument in places when people were pushing him in his administration was, look, we can't get into the business of imitating the Soviets. We have to be leading on these technological issues. And indeed, if you look at how the balance changed, I think, in the last part of the Cold War, the nuclear balance improved from the American point of view. I think if you look at Press and Lieber's recent argument from a few years ago about sort of America's first strike advantages now, by the time you get to the end of the Cold War, you're maybe a stone's throw from the Press and Lieber argument. With the American innovations in anti-submarine warfare, possible, some Russian scholars seem to think, ability to track mobile missiles. A lot of these technological innovations came about from the arms race and actually got, I think, much closer than people think to a posture that looks like it has some damage limiting capabilities. So I would just say that I think that stresses ultimately, in anarchy, there are stable structures and there are less stable structures, but they're still not great structures. They drive this intense competition, even in areas where everybody would really like to agree to sort of hold off. So I think I'll conclude my remarks there and leave the balance to Josh.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back at Williams. Terrific program. Thanks to James and to Kerry Green for putting this together, and thanks to Josh Boss and the State Department. I've been doing a lot of work on contemporary deterrence lately. Issues of how a very large power, the United States, can deter very small but emerging nuclear powers like North Korea and Iran. And when I think about that question, I think deterrence has to mean something. You have to answer a secondary question. Well, what exactly are you trying to deter? Right? You could deter a lot of things. You could deter a rapid expansion of somebody's nuclear program. I think we'd probably be willing to live with Iran with a small, modest nuclear arsenal, but we don't want it to expand that program rapidly. That would scare us. You can try to deter the transfer of nuclear technologies to third parties. Right? We would like to deter Iran from transferring nuclear technologies to Hezbollah. You can deter the use of nuclear weapons to cover conventional aggression, the classic problem of extended deterrence, which people have covered already. And finally, you can deter the use of nuclear weapons in war, perhaps the most important kind of deterrence. Right? These are four very different kinds of behaviors, and it might be possible that the signals that you use to deter one kind of threatening action don't help you deter another kind of threatening action. It's also possible that the signals you use to deter one kind of action are actually counterproductive and might actually stimulate another kind of threat which might worry you. So I've been trying to develop this idea of calibrated deterrence. Is it possible that you can craft some sort of defense posture and foreign policy to help you forestall different kinds of actions, or is this just wishful thinking? Is it even possible? Is this the world we live in now, that we have to make trade-offs between deterring different kinds of actions with emerging but smaller nuclear powers? So I thought it might be interesting to use this framework and then go back and look at a historical case, the Nixon administration. Right? Just ask, was that administration thinking about dealing with a rising Soviet Union the way that we're sort of thinking about dealing with emerging nuclear powers today? Did it ever try to calibrate different deterrent signals to forestall certain threats from the Soviet Union? Did it have any sort of coherent and consistent approach to the problem of deterrence? Did it even try? There's a charitable answer to this question, and there's an uncharitable answer. And I'll come back to that at the end of my comments. Okay, the administration's debate over the concept of sufficiency, which we've discussed already, suggests that there was some thought given to this idea of trying to deter different kinds of behaviors. Sufficiency comes up in a review group meeting early in the administration in May 1969, and then it comes back over and over and over again. These very intense internal debates about the meaning of sufficiency and whether or not it was the appropriate metric to judge the quality of deterrence come up over and over again. And yet the concept remains, and the basic criteria for sufficiency remain pretty consistent through the Nixon administration. Sufficiency meant four things in the official guidance that was written. It was the ability to deter the Soviet Union from a counterforce attack, in other words, to retain the US second strike. The ability to deter the Soviet Union from escalating in a crisis, if things got out of hand, the ability to hold them back. The ability to deter a Soviet counter-value attack by promising greater Soviet damage in an event of war. And finally, the ability to limit damage in the case of small attacks. In other words, the capability to fight and win a limited nuclear war. So there's four elements of sufficiency, though they do overlap in some ways. Put a little more simply, sufficiency should be able to deter Moscow from provocative actions that risk a nuclear war because the risks and costs would be too high. This is deterring the use of nuclear weapons as cover for aggression, as well as deterring Moscow from escalating to the nuclear level in the event of a crisis or a limited conflict, deterring the use of nuclear weapons in war if deterring use as cover fails. So let's dig into this a little bit more. How much did the administration really think about how to stop these different behaviors? First, deterring the use of nuclear weapons as cover. This is extended deterrence. This was the central problem that the administration faced. And it was an especially intense problem because of the environment in which the Nixon administration was working, right? Declining defense budgets, the withdrawal from Vietnam, the drawdown of general purpose forces, intense public disillusionment, intense congressional disillusionment. This was not a very permissive political environment for the Nixon administration to try to make credible threats to defend a third party against the Soviet Union. Right? It was a very hard time politically. Right? And these problems loom over almost every discussion of this issue that comes through in this volume. Right? The secondary problem is there's just a lot of guesswork involved. It's quite clear to me that the administration really didn't know what would work to restore credibility. There was just arguments over best guesses. In August of 1969, Kissinger said, quote, "We need a theory of how to use nuclear weapons in Europe." And David Packard responded, "The truth is that there's no way to use them and no way to get rid of them," as you heard earlier. They didn't know. Kissinger also worried that other allies would misinterpret the Nixon Doctrine. The Nixon Doctrine was supposed to give some of the work to allies, but they worried that allies would see it as abandonment, and thus a serious decline in U.S. credibility. So, at least for Kissinger, the reality of a conventional withdrawal and Allied certainty with dubious nuclear choices maybe meant that arms control was the only way out of this bind. Maybe deterring use as cover was a pipe dream, that this wasn't going to work through traditional conceptions of making credible threats to forestall Soviet actions. Maybe arms control was the necessary way to cut this Gordian knot. What about the second issue, deterring the actual use of nuclear weapons in war? You can talk about this in two ways. One is deterring a first strike, and one is deterring escalation in a crisis, or escalation in a crisis. Deterring a first strike, I'm rather impressed by Richard Nixon here, because he's not terribly concerned about a Soviet first strike, and a lot of people were very concerned about a first strike. Right? David Packard and everybody else who's talking about the SS-9 and this wonder weapon that's going to knock out the U.S. land-based ICBM, the ability to pin down U.S. submarines. People are really freaking out about this, but Nixon isn't freaking out about this, which is really remarkable because he's freaking out about a lot of other things. His commentaries in this are just, they're stunning. His views toward the Joint Chiefs, his views about a range of issues are really intense and wrought. And yet, at the end of the day, he thinks the Soviets aren't going to do this. They're not madmen. Right? They know that they're not going to do something that's going to risk tens and tens of millions of lives. This starts from March 1969 onward. He comes back to this refrain that they won't do it. Right? Nixon's real concern that Kissinger shares is that we will lose bargaining power if we don't have some sort of nuclear advantage. And this is sort of an inchoate argument. I'm not quite clear exactly what bargaining power Nixon thought he was going to get, but it was clear that he worried about losing it. Right? He comes back to these ideas of we can't be a second best. We can't be a mini power. That's going to hurt us somehow. It's not exactly clear how. Others, when they think about deterring the first use, have more tangible answers. I mean, safeguard for some advocates was a way of defending the deterrent, simply making sure that those Minuteman fields would be available if necessary. Right? The issue of deterring intra-crisis escalation, there was a lot of thought given to this, and this was one of the internal and external logics of the safeguard missile defense system. The argument was fairly simple. If you have a smaller hardpoint defense system that defends our missile fields rather than our cities, that will be less escalatory. If the Soviets believe that we can defend our cities, then they will think that we might be more willing to use nuclear weapons in a war. Right? So we're going to try to dampen that escalatory possibility by only defending the fields. This is also implicit in Melvin Laird's push for a new submarine system, and for Nixon's belief in new technologies that will give us the ability to hedge without needlessly provoking the Soviet Union. So there is some thought given to this problem. There's also a third kind of deterrence that the administration is thinking about beyond simply deterring conventional aggression or nuclear use, and that's deterring the expansion of the Soviet strategic program. These discussions that begin in 1969 are happening in the midst of an extraordinary Soviet strategic buildup. It's hard to exaggerate how fast and how massively the Soviets were building their force. But there's a point during the Nixon administration in which the Soviet Union seems to plateau. They seem to slow down in, I think, 1970. And people like Jerry Smith say, hey, maybe they're slowing down, maybe arms control is working, maybe the Soviets are satisfied with this level of parity and we can deter them from spinning it up again. This is something that's quite important. Again, Smith says the way to do this is through arms control, what he calls the diplomacy of restraint. He says that believing essentially that pursuing any new weapon systems, offensive or defensive, will make it look like the U.S. is getting closer to restoring its prior advantage and will stimulate further Soviet buildups. Right? David Packard argues the opposite. Gartoff argues the opposite as well. Things like visibly accelerating American defensive systems will compel the Soviet Union to negotiate. Right? They don't want to be put in a situation in which they're once again behind, so we must work harder in order to bargain that stuff away. So there's thinking going on in terms of all three kinds of deterrence, deterring use as cover, use, and deterring expansion. Okay, now how do we judge all this? Do we give the administration credit for trying to do something like calibrated deterrence or not? Was it trying? Was it just grasping in the wind? The charitable view is that yes, that it was having a serious debate on really hard issues in a really demanding political environment. Kissinger is pushing the Defense Department and state to think imaginatively about using a flexible set of capabilities to deter a number of contingencies. Right? He's, as you've heard already, he's never satisfied with massive retaliation. He thinks that's foolish for a number of reasons, and he wants people to really think about how to use forces more flexibly so we can tailor deterrence more appropriately. Right? This is, the charitable continued, this is the opposite of groupthink. Right? This is a serious effort to wrestle with really hard problems and to give other sides a chance to state their views over and over again. So as frustrating as the debate was at the time, it was a useful kind of frustration. Right? Nixon, who can come across as pretty crude in all senses of the word, actually might deserve some credit, right? I mean, Nixon, we can imagine an alternative history in which Nixon becomes totally convinced that the Soviet Union has the capability to hit us in a first strike, but he doesn't do that. He pulls back. He says, I think that there is an essential level of deterrence that is going to stop the Soviet Union from acting. As somebody said later, there's a clarifying logic of extinction, and this logic is clear to the Soviet Union just as it's clear to the United States. And he deserves credit for that. Despite his overwrought rhetoric about the dangers of being a mini-power or number two, despite his reputation as being a dyed-in-the-wool Cold Warrior, despite his fears that future leaders might not be so rational, he doesn't lose his cool. He doesn't lose this essential truth. That's the charitable answer. Kissinger creates a good, vibrant debate, and Nixon keeps his cool. The uncharitable answer is that the administration never wrapped its head around the problem. There was nothing like a consensus on even basic theoretical issues. There was clearly no resolution of important debates. I mentioned that the administration talked about sufficiency from early on, but all this did was reveal deep divisions about what sufficiency really could and should mean, and lots of guessing. As Jack Smith, a CIA official, said at one point, quote, "We just don't know what constitutes deterrence." So the uncharitable view is that they went round and around and round it, and they never came to a conclusion. There's more uncharitable stuff to say. Kissinger is inconsistent. His view that deterrence is the same as warfighting potential is deeply problematic, and he says this over and over again. This is a very strange comment from somebody who believes that it's all about politics and not all about the technicalities of warfighting. The fact that he comes back to this idea that deterrence is capability, this is very odd. You could criticize Nixon for being too simplistic about credibility and what it means to be a credible power. Maybe he worried about this too much in the context of the Soviet Union. Maybe if he worried less about credibility, he could have accelerated the withdrawal from Vietnam. Right? Maybe he should have listened harder to people at the State Department who were telling them that the Europeans really are going to stay on our side. They don't really have another option. And you could be critical of the administration by noting that while Kissinger and Nixon kept the debate going internally, they confused their advisors about what they really wanted. There's a terrific review group meeting from January 1970 in which Mitchell argues that Nixon said he's for area defense, which is true, and Jerry Smith notes that he wants to negotiate everything, which was also true. So the advisors having this debate didn't know what their principal wanted, right? And finally, you could say, most uncharitably, that despite all of this internal argumentation and debate, Kissinger and Nixon were just going to decide what they wanted to do. That they set up this ongoing argument which goes around and around and around, but at the end of the day, Kissinger is going to write a memo to President Nixon and says, here's what I think you should do, and you should sign here. And Nixon dutifully signs here, every time. Right? So I have this sense in reading through the documents again that there's this giant kabuki dance going on. That despite Kissinger's desire to have this thorough debate, I don't know if he really wanted to have that thorough debate, or whether or not this was just covering his bureaucratic basis for doing something that he would have done anyways. That's the uncharitable view. Now, where do I come out on this? I sort of lean towards the charitable side. I think that given the problem, my views are not set in stone on this. I'm willing to be convinced otherwise. But I think that the debate was good and useful and necessary, even if Kissinger was going to do whatever he was going to do. I think it set in motion a debate that went on for several years afterwards. It did give people an opportunity to air their side of the story. And at the end, I get the sense that Kissinger wanted arms control as a way to lock in what they called a livable world. I don't think that was a bad outcome at the end of all of this. I will stop there and we'll go to Q&A. Thank you.
I will tell everyone I'm going to cut things off exactly at 10:15. I know how important breaks are. At 10:15, I assume there will be people who will want to use facilities. So I'll let you know they're downstairs in the basement, and they're not large and extensive. So 10:15 downstairs. There's nothing upstairs. Okay, with that, I will turn to questions. Jeremy Stern.
So one of the, this is a great panel, one of the things I puzzle with when I read through these documents is trying to figure out to what extent the discussions that are being had in the NSC and elsewhere actually have an effect on day-to-day nuclear operations. Which is to say, is there a way when, in Bill's case, they're discussing the SIOP, or in Laura's case, they're going back and forth on these big concepts? I mean, does it really change things on the ground? I mean, it seems to me there are two ways of looking at this, and I really don't know enough to answer, right? You know, is it that they're able to get the military to actually change the way it's thinking about these things? Or is it that they're having this debate about policy at one level, and there's a military logic that's just going forward on its own? And how do we decipher that? How should we talk about that as scholars of this period?
Who would like to take this question? Because I'm only going to let one of you take it.
Well, there's the military logic that was a big problem, because as I was trying to suggest, it was not until the Reagan administration came in, in the second term, in 86, 87, they did a real review, and they decided the military wasn't providing small options. Still the huge options that were horrible, and small options are horrible, but they wanted to avoid Armageddon somehow. So there's a military standard operating procedures that are very difficult to change, which we don't know a whole lot about, because this stuff is really classified. But Lynn Eden, in some of her writing, gets into this stuff on fire effects and so they kept pushing away, and you get NISTM 242, and then you get Carter's PD 59, and then Reagan goes into this with his employment policy. So the Foster panel sort of starts this process, giving the president some possibility of thinking about options that continues, and it takes a long time. And then they have the options, and the Cold War's over.
Right. You can practice nothing happens, right?
Yeah, fortunately. Pardon me?
There is, to answer your question a little bit, there is a little change that takes place in the 70s. It really accelerates at the end of the 70s, but in this period, there's the intelligence targets begin to shift. The targeting options begin to receive a little bit more examination in different ways to conduct a nuclear war under Nixon's policy. So there are some military intelligence shifts there, but it's not in terms of the large-scale issue that you're talking about. I mean, you're absolutely right. The SIOP doesn't change. It's all massive options. But these small, granular changes in intelligence, for example, begin to emerge.
Bill Leffler.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask Josh Rovner, could you amplify your comments toward the end of your paper when you were talking about the inconsistencies or incoherence in Kissinger's thinking about deterrence, meaning warfighting capabilities? Why do you find that incoherent?
Well, it's a great question, and I guess it comes back partly to Paul Wolfowitz's discussion last night, where he concluded his comments by saying politics is more important than technicalities. Politics is more important than technicalities. Right? The quality of deterrence or arms control or any strategic relationship is going to be based on the political conditions, the political relationship, and less based on the relative technological balance. Right? So I'm sort of surprised by Kissinger, who believes in the same thing. The politics, the details of the warfighting balance should be less important. And yet he comes back to this refrain again and again that you can't deter without being able to fight and win. That you can't have this credible ability to fight and win a war. And that strikes me as inconsistent, because for Kissinger, I think if he was really true to his premise, he could say, no, you can deter without having equivalent warfighting capabilities. You can deter some sort of threat without having to credibly promise that you can win in any meaningful sense. Right? And so I was just sort of surprised that he drifted towards that position, which seemed antithetical to what he was doing. It's especially important given that the whole purpose of what Kissinger is doing is trying to push for safeguard air defense simply so he can trade it away. right? If he really believed that capabilities were necessary for deterrence, he wouldn't have traded that away. He would have tried to keep it.
So, I mean, you've got to,
If I were willing to give up 1 minute of my time and flavor,
Sure. Yes.
I mean, you have to remember that Kissinger started his career challenging massive retaliation. And I think that's where it comes from. The massive retaliation wasn't credible. So, I mean, I just don't, there's part of him that I suspect would have never really been revived.
Bob, did you want to?
Well, I think what Josh is saying here is absolutely true, that Henry Kissinger would come back over a period of time and talk about the Fletcher-All method, and if I might just provide a guess, he's reflecting Mel Laird pretty strongly there. And Mel Laird, and it's interesting to me that so far we haven't referred to the Congress at all. Mel Laird was a guy who, Gary Ford said, had the musical equivalent of perfect pitch in the political area, in that he could know what was going to be doable and what wasn't going to be doable from a resources standpoint. And he came up with the right decisions on that over and over and over again, not losing a single vote the whole time he was Secretary of Defense. And one of his main points, as the ABM thing was coming up for vote in the Senate Armed Services Committee in July of 1969, was that if you don't have ABM, you're not going to ever have any strategic armamentation clause, because we've got to have some bargaining tools here. And it was from that standpoint, and not because it was going to be effective necessarily as a weapon, but it's going to be very effective in negotiating and getting this thing constrained enough so we can get some limitations across the span. And Henry, I think, finally got convinced of that. Bill, would you agree with that?
Makes sense to me.
So that'd be my view. Henry's really reflecting all there.
Bob Jervis?
Yeah. Two things. One, and back to partly what Lori said about Kissinger, that you know, he was in the group of people who worked on nuclear weapons, but not the RAND types. I mean, that it was the broader political for him, and I think even more, he was much more pragmatic or cynical. I mean, how did he get into it? I mean, it wasn't someone like Lori who was interested in the topics. His dissertation was, you know, the Congress of Vienna. And then he gets, as he doesn't get tenure at Harvard, he's drawn into the council study group. He gets famous for writing up other people's ideas. And I want to see what Jeremy's going to say, because he knows Kissinger, you know, from that Henry never had an original idea about nuclear weapons or anything like that. That was not where his intellectual firepower was developed. It was entirely derivative, and I think he never was able to synthesize the different intellectual currents that were flowing, which, as Josh and the others have said, are really sort of contradictory about where credibility comes from, and to put it in starker terms that I like, because I use them in one of my books, on escalation, whether it came from escalation dominance, a view associated with Herman Kahn and later Albert Wallstetter, or whether Henry's a colleague at Harvard who he knew well and borrowed from some, but I think never fully understood, Tom Schelling, that it was manipulation of risk. And I think he vacillated between the two, and that's part of the reason.
But aren't those two actually interrelated?
They're interrelated, but it really, I think, comes down to quite different what you need for hardware. If you believe in warfighting, you know, you really got to take Mel Laird more seriously, and I hope a more discussion about the relation of Laird and Kissinger, and whether Kissinger is influenced by Laird. If you think it's risk, you've got to be able just to do things that scare you and scare the other side, and that's much less demanding from the technical thing. But I think he never is able to resolve the contradiction, and in your charitable and uncharitable, I'd be charitable. I'm not sure anyone can resolve them. So, you know, I think your charitable and uncharitable may have a middle ground.
But Bob, don't you think he's more in the manipulation of risk? than he is? I mean, he might, there's a
Yeah.
little bit of both. But don't you think, in your dichotomy, which I think is very helpful, don't you think he sides with Schelling over Wallstetter, in fact? Right?
I think he does, but I'm not sure he understands that that's what he's doing. But you know, I mean,
Can I just two seconds? Sure. Real quick. I mean, it might be, I mean, this is a fascinating exchange, and there might be a way to think about this, that if Kissinger ultimately did come around to Laird's position that deterrence was based on warfighting capability, that might have increased his skepticism about deterrence in general, because any sort of meaningful victory was impossible in a nuclear exchange, which would have subsequently reinforced his desire for arms control. So, I mean, that might weigh to square this apparent inconsistency.
I would prefer that Laird's position is warfighting.
Oh, no, yeah, I understood. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, I think it's also just worth bearing in mind that these sort of great debates involving Schelling and Card and so on completely petered out by this time. I mean, they'd reached a complete dead end because they couldn't be resolved. So the sort of the quote unquote golden age of nuclear strategic thought, of which Kissinger had been a part, and obviously I agree completely with Bob's presentation of him, in the post-massive retaliation phase, had just come to an end after Berlin and Cuba were sort of sorted. And so nobody's got answers at this point. And people have got bored with the issue because they realise they can't resolve it. So I think that's an important point. The other thing just to bear in mind on the think tank side, of course, Kahn's own institute, Hudson, was big supporters of ABM. And one of the guys, again, who was worth bearing in mind in all of this was Don Brennan, who had been one of the sort of liberal arms controllers of the that sort of great Daedalus volume of 1960, but had come round to this and was sort of part of the counterculture within the arms control community, which was pushing ABM. Rather sad character, and he committed suicide, I think.
Joe?
Dr. Freedman, excuse me, maybe you've already answered the question, but the issue of when you say that there was no way out of the problem, the issue of victory, you know, this, was it possible in the nuclear world and the world of the Nixon administration? I mean, the argument had broken out, had been going on since the late 60s. I mean, McNamara and Wheeler broke over it, whether it was not only possible but winnable. Jim Schlesinger, during the Nixon administration, said he thought NAD was just a bad declaratory policy, and made some moves to try and retarget, to limit. And that would indicate to me that there were thoughts, if you were doing that, of winning. And I guess that's my question really to anybody. Within the Nixon administration, what went on, both in the government, in the political apparatus and the military apparatus, was there a conception of victory?
Not really is the answer. I mean, the articles, you know, the sort of the terrible twins of sort of Luttwak and Colin Gray came in the late 70s, and even Colin Gray would argue it was somebody else gave him his headline when he started talking about theory of victory. And I just don't think, I think although they didn't like assured destruction as a declaratory policy, as a statement of where they were, it was pretty accurate. There's a famous, it was just before this period, I think it was during the first ABM debate, so 67, 68, and I think it was Senator Russell was asked, was sort of arguing for ABMs, and he said, and if in the end we have to start with Adam and Eve over again, I want them to be American. And somebody said, well, what happens if one of them's black? Sorry about that.
There's a quick follow. I can't top that. But there's a quick follow-on. I think at least with Kissinger and others believed that victory was possible, both in the late 70s and late 60s and early 70s. I think Kissinger just looked at the American objective broadly as the preservation of the status quo, right?
Yeah.
And so if you think about what victory would mean, it's preserving what you already have, but losing how many millions, right? It's not a matter of victory per se, but how much will you suffer in the event? So I think that Kissinger, and this is, I'd love to hear other people's views, Kissinger, I doubt, thought that victory was possible.
No, I think this is my judgment, and the three secretaries I served with, I never heard the word victory.
Okay.
I mean, even the Foster panel would say maybe our relative position would be better.
Yeah.
But that'd be in a
That's-
position of
that's-
total
That's
catastrophe.
the language they use, isn't it? Relative.
Yeah.
That was
A relative
the military
position.
substitute,
Yeah.
certainly.
I'm going to give Bob the last point.
Just two. It's fascinating, at least for those of us in IOR, to see how they get hung up on what we call the relative versus absolute gains problem. That is, when it comes up, especially on sufficiency and advantage, and they touch on, are we talking in relative or absolute terms? And they sort of open that black box and immediately shut it. They won't deal with it, and I think for this reason, it raises the victory question.
Okay, I would like to thank our panelists.